Hi, this is the unwanted effects of reinforcement when reinforcement backfires. What every BCBA needs to know. I'm Nicole Jacobs, and I'm here to give you a quick little uptake into what we all kind of sometimes not realize, but always need to understand. Since reinforcement is the backbone of behavior analysis, but what if I told you that it can actually create problem behaviors, right? It can reduce motivation and it can even harm independent if it's used incorrectly. Yeah, it's happened many times. So let's give it a go and take a look. All right. So, um, in ABA, reinforcement we know increases behavior. It's simple, right? But there's an issue. When we increase behavior, it's not always increasing behavior may not always be our goal. We want durable behavior. We want to have independent behavior. We want to have generalized behavior. So our objective today is going to be to identify some unintended effects of that reinforcement. And we're going to try to explain how they impact behavior. Maybe even try to apply some of those preventions to help them in our practice. All right. So, what exactly is reinforcement? Well, in behavior analysis, reinforcement is any consequence that increases a behavior, right? So if it happens, the behavior is happening again, then it's was reinforced. Well, it can be positive when we like add a stimulus and to the behavior and the behavior goes up, like praise or tokens or attention. But it can also be negative. And when we remove that aversive stimulus following the behavior, if that behavior still goes up, it's reinforcement. So we have our negative, we have our positive. In this case, negative is when they're like escaping from a non-preferred task, right? Oh, well, I really don't want to do my math homework. Okay, fine, no problem. You could do three problems instead of all 10. That would be our negative reinforcement because we're removing some of that stimulus to get the behavior to happen, right? So understanding that reinforcement's a pretty powerful tool, but sometimes, without precision, it can lead to unintended consequences. It's not totally risk-free. Understanding both sides of this is essential for ethical and effective practice. So, why does that matter so much? Well, even correct reinforcement can backfire. It can inadvertently strengthen the wrong behavior, or it can create an unexpected outcome and patterns of behavior. It can create dependency. Many learners can become dependent on external reinforcement. How does that happen? What do you mean they can become dependent, right? Well, unfortunately, sometimes, we don't realize it, but they do. They only become motivated if that stimulus is there. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Um, or we can even end up accidentally strengthening the wrong behavior. So even though we're looking at the target behavior, sometimes we end up reinforcing some undesired stuff that we don't along the way, right? So BCBAs, they've got to really think beyond, did the behavior increase? You got to more like ask yourself, what else might have changed and at what cost? So let's take a look at some factors and how we have some unwanted effects, okay? Some really hidden stuff that might be happening. So even when um, reinforcement procedures are implemented correctly, according to behavioral principles, there are some unintended effects that can emerge. BCBAs have to evaluate all outcomes beyond the simple question of whether that behavior increased. Satiation is one of them. This is when reinforcers lose value and our behavior drops, right? So that reinforcer was highly effective. It was great. And then we kind of used it a lot, right? And it lost its effectiveness because we overused it. So an example of that would be like, okay, candy, right? Student loves candy, great value. But then after a while, like, I don't want candy anymore, right? They start perceiving that, oh, candy in the morning, I really don't want that. And it now all of a sudden the skill can be lost because the reinforcer has lost that potency. So target behavior decreases. BCBA may incorrectly interpret this as a skill regression or increased task difficulty when the true issue here is actually motivation, right? So you really need to think about, rotating those reinforcers actually quite frequently. You want to keep that, kind of keeping it from satiating. Okay. All right, let's take a look at some next ones. This is when we've got our reinforcement dependency. This is what we were talking about before a minute ago. Students become reward dependent performers, right? The student ends up relying on the reinforcement in order to perform the task. And they won't do it unless that they know they're getting it rewarded. And so in this case, you have your reinforcement dependency. An example of this would be like a student says, I'll only work if I get rewarded. Well, okay, interesting. So that is the signal that the behavior is under the tight control of that stimulus rather than actually the reinforcer itself. And we want to be able to fade them and fade this so it becomes a more natural consequence from that environment. So it's important that we are doing that and we're not letting them become reinforcement dependent so that we are doing what we're supposed to do as ethically as a behavior analyst with our clients is increasing that independence. And when we have reinforcement dependency, it's lacking independence. So remember, always fade your reinforcement systematically and gradually over time, thinning those schedules, moving from continuous to intermittent. We want to be able to build resilience and we want to be able to promote independency across settings. So then we have our intrinsic motivation. Now you're like, wait, reduced intrinsic motivation? Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? Well, in this case, the external rewards are overriding the natural instinct. So, this is one of the most studied and probably debated effects in behavioral research, and that's when external rewards are introduced for behaviors that the learner already finds intrinsically motivating. What? When do you do that? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Who would do such a thing? Well, you would be so surprised how often this happens in classrooms everywhere, right? Those natural rewards become undermined. And a phenomenon, sometimes called the overjustification effect, ends up playing a role. So when we're taking external rewards and replacing them with internal motivation, like why would you do that? Why would anybody do that? But believe it or not, here's an example. When a student loves reading already, and then they're going to a classroom, and then the teacher goes, oh, well, I'm going to start giving out rewards for when you finish reading your books. Well, what happened to that kid that already loved reading? Now, all of a sudden, that reading is replaced, that internal motivation is replaced by external reinforcers. What? Why would you do such a thing? Now the student stops reading unless they're rewarded. Hello, duh. Behavior starts dropping and reinforcement stops, right? So we want to try to make sure that we reserve those artificial reinforcements for behaviors that are not already intrinsically motivated. Do your FBA. Make sure you understand what your behavior that you're reinforcing is so that we don't artificially reinforce behaviors that we don't need to. All right. Let's take a look at another one. And again, very similar reward expectancy, right? Learner waits for the reward before they even act, right? Expectancy develops. What happens? They want, oh, no, no, I know that there's a reward coming and I am expecting it. So the learner learns that the reward is going to follow after the instruction or the prompt, and they begin to anticipate it, right? Because before they even go to do the behavior. In fact, they start asking, what do I get? Sometimes the learner's first response, latency increases. We don't want latency. We want them to be able to start doing it right away. We don't want a delayed response. And that's exactly what we're going to end up getting because the behavior becomes conditional over the reward, right? And now we're reducing generalization, we're reducing functional independence, and the student only completes assignments when given points, right? Or given the token or given the reward. So teacher then, let's say teacher starts to remove the points, well, work stops completely, right? What? Wait, what? What was the behavior actually learned, or am I actually purchasing it? What are we doing? Okay. So here we have to make sure we are very clear. Is the reward expectancy can sometimes masquerade as motivation, but it's actually the form of prompt dependency. So be careful, and you want to be able to monitor, is there a delayed response? Is there verbal negotiation happening with the client? Or is there a refusal to do the task in the absence of the reinforcer? If that's the case, then you've got reward expectancy, and we want to try to reduce that from happening. Okay? So be very, very careful that that's not something that like moving into. All right, now we've got reinforcing the wrong behavior. Uh-oh. We might actually very well reinforce the behaviors that we actually want to reduce. So accidental or inadvertent reinforcement is among the most common and clinically significant risks in ABA. So it occurs when the practitioner, your therapist, your teacher, your caregiver is unintentionally delivering a reinforcer contingent on the undesired behavior. Thereby, you're strengthening it. This happens in classrooms, at homes, all the time. And you don't even realize you're doing it, right? And that's like for a situation like this, the kids are screaming. Kids are screaming loudly during independent work. Maybe the teacher then comes over because they're trying to like calm everybody down and slow down, slow down, slow down. And immediately, what is the teacher doing? Teacher is giving attention. Teacher is trying to redirect. Teacher is, accessing, that preferred activity to stop the behavior of yelling. But inadvertently, what is the teacher doing? Is giving the attention. And that's the powerful reinforcer. You have to be sure that you do an FBA to identify whether or not every time attention is given, is the behavior continuing to happen? If it's continuing to happen, why is it continuing to happen? What's happening right before? So this happens so often. And in order to correct it, we always want to make sure that we're doing that FBA to ensure that the reinforcement is delivered contingent on the target behavior, not the problem behavior. What do you do? What do you do in this case if they're yelling and try to fix it? We start working on what's called planned ignoring or add differential reinforcement. And that's the key. Between planned ignoring and differential reinforcement, we now get what we need to correct the behavior. All right. Now we got this other one, which is called our behavior contrast. This is great in when we get great behavior in one setting because they're getting what they want, but then we got terrible behavior in a whole nother setting, right? So I see this so many times. You have your student is working super well in your ABA classroom. It's working beautifully. They're getting all the reinforcements that they need. It's a reinforcement rich classroom. Wonderful. But then they go over to the mainstream classroom, and that reinforcement schedule is not in play there. Uh-oh. All of a sudden, those were not engaged in the same behaviors, right? So student receives that reinforcement in the ABA, showing excellent on-task behavior, but when they go to the mainstream classroom, that behavior deteriorates. And it's like they didn't even go to therapy. It's like, well, they're not, it's not working. Well, that's called behavior contrast. How do we fix this, right? Into fixing this, we have to understand why is it happening? You have a super dense reinforcement schedule in that ABA learn room, and then the learner, right, goes over to the other classroom where it doesn't have all of those reinforcements. So the child or the learner ends up thinking, oh, well, I don't need to do this because I'm not getting it. So it's almost like your prompt dependency, right? Or your reward dependency a little bit because we have not thinned the schedule in the ABA classroom. So you want to try either to coordinate with all the team members and your settings and You want to try to start generalizing the programming to accompany the intensive reinforcement system. So either the mainstream classroom's got to bring up the reinforcement system a little bit, or you start fading down that reinforcement system in the therapy classroom so that we can try to match it very similar to what we have in the mainstream classroom. All right. And then our last one is when we have our competing behaviors and low quality of performance. Oh my goodness, as a teacher, I know do your homework and it's a completion grade. Well, when we reinforce 100% because you did your homework, even though they might have gotten incorrect questions, well, that's when we're reinforcing completion rather than quality. And in this case, we're inadvertently strengthening behaviors that actually compete with what is the intended outcome. Students will do just enough to get that reward. So when reinforcement is delivered for completion rather than quality, right, it inadvertently strengthens the behavior that compete with the intended learning outcome. The learner discovers that rushing, for example, produces the same reinforcement as if they were careful or did high quality work. It doesn't matter. I could just rush right through this. It doesn't make a difference. Or, hey, I could take a snapshot of this and put this in AI and I could submit it and I still get 100% credit for it. Beautiful. I did the work. It's over. It's done. When that happens, oh boy, we start creating a pattern, right? A pattern of rushing through our assignments. Even though they're wrong, it doesn't make a difference. I'm still getting rewarded because I did it. That's it. So we're reinforcing speed over quality, or are we reinforcing going to AI, going to ChatGPT, going to Gemini to do our homework instead of really trying their hardest to figure it out? Okay. What's the risk here? Well, over time, the learner's just going to develop this low effort habit, right? And that's not what we want. We want to make sure that they are able to develop the skill, to develop mastery, and not inflate the performance data. Okay. So how do we fix it? You want to be able to specify very clear criteria, reinforce quality, reinforce accuracy, not just for task completion all the time. You want to do this for fluency-based criteria. Shaping performance standards gradually helps us to reinforce high quality responding. All right. So really important, just a couple things left I want to make sure we understand. And we have to always remember that all reinforcers, they need to make sure that they are socially appropriate for all learners, no matter their age, their culture, their setting, their dignity. Reinforcers can sometimes be inappropriate depending on your learner, right? You don't want to use sticker charts or cartoon themed token boards for adults or, adolescents because it's going to draw unwanted like peer attention. And it's going to make them look like they're babies. So you want to make sure that you are understanding what is the reinforcers that you are providing to the particular learner that's in front of you. Okay. Making sure that according to the behavior analyst, we are always reinforcing our reinforcers are always promoting dignity. They cannot be coercive. They should lead to meaningful outcomes, something that is meaningful for that learner, no matter their age, their culture, their setting. And reinforcements should always preserve dignity and they should be appropriate and humane. Ask yourself, would a same age peer find this reinforcer typical or embarrassing? Okay. Is this reinforcer available in the learner's natural environment? Does the learner endorse this reinforcer as desirable? Do they like it, right? Or, ooh, or does it even align with the learner's cultural values and preferences? So keeping all of this in mind is super important when we think about those reinforcers so that we're always thinking about what is in the best interest of our learner. Okay. Social validity, it's really not optional. It's your professional and ethical obligation. Always involve the learner and the caregivers in that reinforcer selection. All righty. So, any solutions today? Always fade your reinforcements, use natural contingencies, make sure you reinforce independence, prioritize skill building over compliance. Please, please, please make sure you are varying those reinforcers. Fade reinforcement as much as you can. Pair the natural environment to it as much as you can because you want that natural consequence always happening as much as possible, and reinforce quality, not just completion. All right. So reinforcement, it isn't just about getting behavior. It's really about building humans who can function with it. So please, shaping behavior independence, it's for long-term success. When reinforcement is delivered for completion rather than quality, it can inadvertently strengthen behaviors that compete with the intended learning outcome. The learners discover that rushing produces the same reinforcing outcome as careful, high quality work. Reinforcement doesn't just change behavior. It doesn't just shape behavior. It shapes motivation, it shapes independence, and it shapes our long-term success. So think holistically, consider all the different behavioral outcomes, act proactively, think about your learner first, okay? And always stay ethical. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a very, very great day.